There is a distinct, inescapable odor that embeds itself into your very DNA when you work a deep fryer for too long. It is a rancid perfume of atomized grease, cheap salt, and crushed dreams, clinging to your hair and seeping into your pores until you become a walking advertisement for cardiovascular disease. But that smell is nothing compared to the stench of corporate betrayal. If you have ever poured your soul into a thankless job only to be crushed under the boot of an incompetent, arrogant boss, you know exactly what I am talking about. This is a story about the breaking point. It is a story about a hot summer, a legendary heavy metal concert, and a brilliantly petty act of silicon sabotage that turned an ordinary fast food kitchen into an absolute madhouse. It was the summer of 1986. I was 23 years old, burning away my youth as an assistant manager at the Brass Jester, a fast food joint where the polyester uniforms were as stiff as the frozen burger patties. For 2 grueling years, I had dragged my exhausted body through 12-hour shifts, managing a ragtag crew of 17 to 19-year-old high schoolers. They were a great bunch of kids, skaters, misfits, and garage band guitarists who made the fluorescent purgatory bearable. What made the job a living nightmare were the other 2 assistant managers. Let us call them Vespera and Thorn. Vespera was a tyrant with an ego the size of a walk-in freezer and a breath that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and malice. Thorn was a textbook narcissist, a man who believed his slicked-back hair and cheap cologne masked the fact that he possessed the intellectual depth of a puddle. To make matters infinitely worse, Vespera and Thorn were secretly seeing each other. I say secretly with heavy sarcasm because they spent half their shifts sneaking into the dry storage room, a mental image that still triggers my gag reflex to this day. We all despised them. They were lazy, entitled, and completely useless on the floor. The simmering tension boiled over the week of the Shattered Anvil concert. Shattered Anvil was the biggest heavy metal band on the planet at the time, and they were playing a sold-out Saturday night show at the Copper Dome in the city. My friends and I had scored tickets months in advance. We had literally counted down the days. It was going to be the highlight of the summer. Then, the unthinkable happened. Vespera and Thorn cornered the oblivious general manager and somehow convinced him to give them both Saturday and Sunday off for a romantic getaway to a cabin up in Mount Shasta. Because the store required a manager on duty at all times, the GM simply crossed out my approved time off and penned my name over their weekend shifts. No discussion, no apology. Just a casual death sentence to my weekend plans. I was expected to work an open-to-close double shift while these 2 narcissists went off to drink overpriced wine in the mountains. I was livid. A blinding, white-hot rage coursed through my veins. After months of covering for their incompetence, this was the final insult. I hated the job anyway. I was 23, and I decided right then and there that I was not going to miss the most anticipated concert of the decade. I was going to quit, but simply handing in my keys felt far too quiet. If Friday night was going to be my final shift, I was going out in legendary scorched earth fashion. Friday evening arrived, thick with humidity and the suffocating smugness of Vespera and Thorn. The 2 of them spent the entire day gloating about their impending Mount Shasta vacation. They leaned against the stainless steel counters, loudly discussing the expensive Napa Valley Merlot they had purchased. At one point, Vespera slyly hinted at the new silk lingerie she had packed, prompting a collective, synchronized shudder from the teenage fry cooks within earshot. I simply smiled, nodded, and let them talk. They mercifully clocked out at 9 o'clock, leaving me alone to manage a packed dining room for the remainder of the night. The hours ticked by in a blur of ringing registers and sizzling beef. Finally, at midnight, I locked the front doors. I spent the next 2 hours helping the crew scrub the floors with cheap bleach, wiping down the greasy countertops until the stainless steel gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Once the last teenager was sent home, I was entirely alone in the silent restaurant. It was time to go to work. In the dark ages of the mid-80s, the point-of-sale computer systems were essentially glorified calculators hooked up to bulky, amber-glow CRT monitors. The keyboards were pre-programmed with specific buttons for the time of day. You had a breakfast tier, a lunch tier, and a dinner tier. If a customer ordered during the morning, the cashier pressed the physical buttons mapped to breakfast items. If they wanted a signature Jester burger and a side of Jester fries at 7 in the evening, the cashier had to switch the terminal to the dinner tier and press the specific keys for those items. When a key was pressed, 2 things happened simultaneously. First, the item populated on the video monitors suspended above the grill and the fry stations in the kitchen, telling the cooks what to make. Second, the item printed on a thermal paper receipt. This part was crucial. Company policy dictated that every single customer must be handed their printed receipt. If the cashier forgot, the customer was entitled to a free meal voucher. I walked into the cramped back office, pulled up the master terminal, and accessed the menu programming directory. It was a clunky, text-based interface, but it was surprisingly easy to manipulate if you knew the keystrokes. I bypassed the breakfast and lunch menus entirely. Vespera and Thorn were scheduled to arrive at 6 in the morning on Saturday to work the open. The dinner menu, however, was not touched until 5 o'clock in the evening, exactly the time I was supposed to arrive to relieve them. I selected the dinner tier. I highlighted the jester fries. I deleted the text. In its place, I typed a highly specific, devastatingly petty phrase. I moved to the jester burger, then the onion rings, then the sodas, reprogramming the display text for every single dinner item. The trap was set. The only danger was if someone accidentally toggled to the dinner menu during the morning or afternoon rush, which would expose the sabotage prematurely. I had to gamble that the busy Saturday pace would keep them strictly in the lunch tier until the sun went down. Saturday morning dawned. By all accounts from the crew, it was a wildly busy day. Vespera and Thorn strutted around the store, complaining about the heat and loudly reminding everyone that as soon as I arrived at 5 o'clock, they were hitting the highway for Mount Shasta. The hours ticked by. Breakfast seamlessly transitioned into lunch. Not a single cashier accidentally pressed a dinner key. 5 o'clock arrived. I did not. Instead, I was cruising up the highway in my buddy's beat-up sedan, the windows rolled down, a heavy metal cassette tape rattling the door speakers. Back at the Brass Jester, the dinner rush began to swell. The dining room packed tightly with families, teenagers, and weary travelers. Vespera and Thorn, undoubtedly fuming that I was late, were forced to jump on the front registers to help clear the massive line of customers. At exactly 6 o'clock, a man stepped up to Vespera's register. "Hi," he said. "I'll have 2 Jester burger combos with large fries and a cola." Vespera tapped the screen, switched the terminal to the dinner tier, and aggressively punched the keys for the burgers, the fries, and the drink. She hit the total button. In the kitchen, the amber CRT monitor above the grill chimed loudly. The teenage grill cook looked up to read the order. He blinked, he rubbed his eyes, he looked again. Instead of reading 2 Jester burgers, the glowing green text proudly declared, *2 orders THORNE Mounts Barnyard ANIMALS. Before the grill cook could even process what he was seeing, the monitor above the fry station chimed. The fry cook looked up. His screen read, 2 orders VSBERA's Toxic Swamp Breath. A split second of utter, bewildered silence hung over the kitchen. And then, a 17-year-old kid named Toby let out a bark of laughter so loud it echoed off the aluminum vents. Within seconds, the entire backline erupted into absolute, unhinged pandemonium. The crew was literally doubling over, clutching their stomachs as tears streamed down their faces. But the sheer brilliance of the trap was that the store was in the middle of a massive rush. The teenagers couldn't just stop working. They had to keep the food moving. To do that, they had to figure out what my new glossary of insults actually translated to on the menu. "Toby," the grill cook screamed over the laughter. "What the hell is a barnyard animals?" "It's a Jester burger," Toby howled back, wiping a tear from his eye. "I need 2 more of Vespera's swamp breath holding the salt. Drop another basket of Thorn's microscopic manhood." The kitchen became a symphony of glorious, profane chaos. Teenagers were shouting out insults at the top of their lungs just to coordinate the fry baskets and the grill space. Meanwhile, at the front counter, Vespera heard the roaring laughter and the bizarre shouting. She glared back at the kitchen, completely confused. She turned back to the customer, ripped the thermal paper receipt from the machine, and handed it to him with a stiff, artificial smile. The customer took the receipt. He looked down at it. The company policy was absolute. The receipt showed exactly what was on the kitchen monitors. The man's jaw dropped. He looked at Vespera, looked at the receipt, and slowly backed away from the counter. It was at this precise moment, miles away in San Mateo, that I pulled into a gas station. I dropped a quarter into a greasy payphone and dialed the restaurant's number. Vespera answered on the second ring, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "Brass Jester, this is Vespera." "Hey Vespera," I said casually, leaning against the plastic hood of the payphone. "You know what? I've been thinking about it, and I don't really feel like coming in tonight." "What the fuck did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking loud enough that I had to pull the receiver away from my ear. In the background, I could clearly hear a teenager yell, I need 3 more orders of Vespera Mount's livestock. Yeah, I'm not missing the Shattered Anvil concert, I continued, ignoring her meltdown. So I quit. Enjoy Mount Shasta. I heard a muffled gasp, a frantic sputtering of half-formed words, and I gently placed the receiver back on the hook. The rest of the night at the Brass Jester is still spoken of in hushed, reverent tones by anyone who was there. Vespera and Thorn were utterly clueless when it came to technology. They had no idea how to access the programming menu to change the keys back. The store manager was out of town, completely unreachable. Because the lobby was packed with a line out the door, they couldn't shut the registers down. For 6 agonizing hours, Vespera and Thorn had to endure the humiliation of their teenage crew screaming out hyper-specific insults about their hygiene and anatomy. Even worse, they had to physically hand hundreds of printed receipts to bewildered customers, staring them dead in the eye while handing over a slip of paper that read, "Thorn has a pathetic pebble asterisk." They eventually had to call in the regional director for Golden Crown Enterprises, pulling him out of his own home on a Saturday night. He didn't arrive until midnight to reset the system. The aftermath was glorious. Because I had vanished into the night, Vespera and Thorn had to cover my vacant shifts. Their romantic weekend in the mountains was completely obliterated. They spent the next 7 days working grueling, back-to-back open-to-close shifts. There was no overpriced Merlot. There was no silk lingerie. Just the lingering smell of atomized grease and the smirking faces of a kitchen crew who had witnessed the greatest shift in fast food history. Thorn was fired a week later by the regional director for the chaos that unfolded. Vespera hung around for a miserable 3 months before quietly resigning, fading into retail obscurity. I ran into the old general manager years later at a hardware store. He looked at me, shook his head, and admitted that, off the record, it was the funniest thing he had ever seen in his entire career. As for me, the Shattered Anvil concert was an absolute masterpiece. The music was loud, the crowd was electric, and the taste of freedom was sweeter than anything I had ever known. More importantly, that night awakened something in me. Realizing the sheer power of code and the magic of manipulating a computer system, I found my true calling. I went back to school, studied computer science, and I am still a software engineer to this very day. If there is a lesson to be pulled from the greasy ashes of the Brass Jester, it is this: never underestimate the people who quietly clean up your messes. Respect your crew, do your own work, and if you are going to steal someone's weekend, you had better know how to reprogram a point-of-sale terminal. If you enjoyed this story of Silicon sabotage, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share your own tales of workplace revenge in the comments below. Stay frosty, my friends, and always remember, don't get mad, get even.